Brace yourself for something fuel-nominal. Unleaded 88 is the clear fuel choice. It's cheaper, cleaner, and greener. And it's grown by Iowa corn farmers. Now that's totally worth the hype. So pump it up with Unleaded 88.
This is the story of the one. As head of maintenance at a concert hall, he knows the show must always go on. That's why he works behind the scenes, ensuring every light is working, the HVAC is humming, and his facility shines. With Grainger's supplies and solutions for every challenge he faces, plus 24/7 customer support, his venue never misses a beat. Call quickgrainger.com or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
With your host, Andrew Donaldson. This is Heard Tell.
Welcome back to Heard Tell. Burt, Likko, one of our lawyer folks, he is the editor emeritus of ordinary-times.com, the publication that I try not to go off the cliff because he will yell at me for it. Sir, how are you?
I'm doing well, Andrew. I have just a moment's bit of confusion about what we're going to be talking about today because it is not within my area of legal expertise or experience.
Well, once you've written about it, I went back and checked roughly 8,000 to 9,000 words about it. I think we can just set that to the side for the moment. But let's talk about this legal mess a little bit. As we're recording this, one interesting side bit that I think is a good window into the overall scheme. You've done trials. You've been a lawyer. The judge had a stern talking to Donald J. Trump and counsel today. In the grand scheme of things, this is not unusual. This is pretty common. Somebody does something, somebody gets a little out of line. A lot of these is the first hearing or the first procedural motion. A judge will do this. They'll just lay out the ground rules. Every judge has a little bit different kind of way they want to do their courts. This is not unusual. It is extraordinary because who it is and why they're having to do it. But this is actually just part of the legal system. Somebody starts pushing the boundaries and the judge pushes back and the lawyers push boundaries and the judge pushes back and the state and the prosecutors push boundaries and the judge pushes back. This is all part and parcel of the system, isn't it?
This happens in every case. The judge is in charge of what happens in the case, not the lawyers, not the parties. The judge will sometimes give parties a lot of play to get things resolved the way they like. But make no mistake, especially in a federal court, the judge is not playing. And this judge is really not playing with this defendant.
And the federal part is really important here because federal court is a whole different beast. Although it has a lot of the same trappings of the legal system, this is very much its own thing. It's, I don't know if exclusive is the right word, but it's a much different club of people that participate in the federal system. The judges are all appointed. They're all very secure in their positions. They have some of the most powerful positions in the legal system. This is a very ingrained institution that Donald J. Trump finds himself subjected to here.
And the judges are untouchable by design. They have a lifetime appointment for good behavior. Good behavior means as long as they don't commit any major crimes or do something so awful that they literally get themselves impeached. So their salaries cannot be diminished. Their jobs cannot be taken away from them. They're supposed to be immune from political pressure. And that's exactly the sort of thing that a fellow like Trump could be bringing to bear in a different sort of arena, but not in federal court.
This brings up Burt Likko joining us. This brings up one of the pieces of this that I don't hear discussed enough, in my opinion. For one of the first times in his life, especially the last 10 years or so, as his public profile rose to stardom and then the political career, Donald J. Trump has almost no control over what's happening right now. He's entitled to his defense. He has rights in the courtroom, and the judge, even in kind of excoriating his team a little bit in his comments today, she was very careful to say, you have a right to do this, you don't have a right to do that. He has a lot of rights, but he has almost no control over what's actually going on in this process. Court humbles you. I don't care who you are. I've been through not criminal proceedings, but civil proceedings and things like that. I've had to be in a courtroom. I've had to testify before. it's a humbling thing. I don't care who you are, how powerful you are. When you go in there and they start throwing around the jargon and you don't really fully understand it all, even some lawyers don't fully understand it all, it's humbling. It's intimidating. This is an interesting way to watch how he conducts himself going forward, don't you think?
I've had clients comment about that to me before. I do civil litigation, so those would have been matters not unlike the ones that brought you to court. And I've had clients tell me before that they find the process super intimidating, super scary. And I'm used to it because I do this for a living. A court does not have that same sort of emotional effect on me, but that's because I know what's inside that black box. It's because I'm used to seeing that building with the columns and the marble and the security guards and the marshals and the judge sitting up on that high wooden bench with the big seal and all of the trappings, and then all of the ceremonies that you're going to find there. They seem very routine and normal to the people who work there every day. But if you're not there, that ceremony of being sworn in to testify under penalty of perjury, having to walk from wherever it is you are across that big courtroom, across all that empty space that's been created, that's there to impress upon you the importance and the gravity of what's happening. And you have felt that. Many people who go to court feel that effect, that, I am now in kind of a sacred space. And it's supposed to do that. That's why courts look the way they do.
Yeah. Here's the thing about that, and TV doesn't convey this, and even court reporters don't talk about this part of it. I know this is basic stuff, but I want to cover the basics of how trials like this actually work before you actually talk about, because we skip ahead to the evidence and all that. It's like, well, no, all this procedural stuff to get to the evidence, this is important. When you're actually in the courtroom and you're not the lawyer, you're either the plaintiff or the defendant or whatever the case may be, you're bringing a lawsuit, you're part of a divorce action or a custody hearing, whatever the case may be. When you're a part of the system, there's this other thing that happens in the court that you don't get on TV. You're an attorney. You're talking to the other attorney. You and the other attorney are talking to the judge. You're talking to the clerk. You're talking to the bailiff. You're talking to the people that are shuffling paper. You're amongst it, but you're not in it. There's this whole system. There's a language. There's a rhythm to it. Everybody seems like they're all friends, and then you start the proceeding and the switch flips, and now they're adversarial, and then they gavel back out for lunch, and now they're all back being friends and talking together, and they go eat their lunches and all that. There's a thing about whoever's involved in this. The system really is a system, isn't it? And it's an ecosystem, and the person that isn't part of that system, you feel that intrinsically when you sit there, like this thing has its own rhythm. It's its own planet.
Yeah, you could feel like a dog on a surfboard. The wave is pushing you along. There's somebody else on that surfboard who's guiding it, and you aren't real sure what's happening. You might enjoy it. You might be scared by it. And the only thing that you really know how to do is just stay on that surfboard because you really don't want to be anywhere that you're outside of that surfboard.
That's the sound of your current hype level at the gas pump. But brace yourself for something fuel nominal, because Unleaded 88 is about to take the hype to a whole new level. Unleaded 88 is cheaper, cleaner, and greener than regular unleaded. Plus, it's homegrown, making Unleaded 88 the clear choice at the pump and totally worth the hype. So pump it up with Unleaded 88, brought to you by Iowa Corn.
This is the story of the one. As head of maintenance at a concert hall, he knows the show must always go on. That's why he works behind the scenes, ensuring every light is working, the HVAC is humming, and his facility shines. With Grainger's supplies and solutions for every challenge he faces, plus 24/7 customer support, his venue never misses a beat. Call quickgrainger.com or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
Yeah, Burt Likko joining us. One reason I wanted to talk to you about this was when the January 6th stuff happened. Look, I wrote my piece on January 6th on January the 7th. I wrote it that night, posted the next day. I think it's held up well. I haven't really changed my mind about just about anything since I wrote that. A little bit after that, you started writing about the legal stuff. We've talked about it before, but just kind of to recap how we got here to the current batch of indictments for the January 6th stuff. Almost every attorney I talked to, whether they were a progressive attorney, conservative attorney, whatever, almost all of them told me, look, if you're going to prosecute Donald Trump for January 6th, you're not going to get him on inciting a riot or the speech part or the rally part. That's just not going to be doable. Like, they could charge it, but you'd never get it. Almost every attorney I talked to said that. So and then you've written about the actual machinations in Congress that day and by proxy in the White House planning it, the fake set of electors, the Pence angle, the Pence card they called it, trying to overthrow and throw this back to the states. You took it from that angle and laid out the law of that. Now we actually have the indictment for the January 6th stuff. They skipped all the rally stuff. They skipped the inciting the riot stuff. They went straight to fraud and conspiracy charges. You wrote about it a year before it happened, year and a half. Now we actually have the charges. Just based on what you thought, was this the smart way to attract it? Was this a better path of attracting it? Because everybody thought the inciting a riot thing, while real popular on Twitter, wasn't actually going to go anywhere. And that's kind of what we wound up with. Is this what you expected?
I certainly expected most of what Trump was doing personally at the rally out there by the Washington Monument, making different kinds of speeches. That probably is all protected political speech. What isn't protected is making use of violence once it begins. And what isn't protected is deliberately avoiding discharging his duties. For me, the most morally damning thing that we can know as an objective fact that happened, and I think we need to talk a little bit about the intent of the actual crimes alleged in the indictment. But we can know objectively that Trump sat in a chair inside the Oval Office for 3 hours and watched it on TV and did nothing. This is not taking good care that the laws be faithfully executed. It's certainly not keeping the peace. And personally, I think it's contemptible. But let me try and keep my opinion out of my legal analysis. Making political remarks to a crowd of people gathered for a political purpose is First Amendment protected speech. You don't have to agree with it. You don't have to like it. It doesn't have to be true. And the indictment says so. The indictment makes it really clear that Donald Trump had a right to get up in front of a crowd of people and lie to them, which is what he did. What he doesn't have a right to do is disrupt an official proceeding of the United States of America, even if he is at that time the president.
There's a little bit of a thing going around. Burt Likko joining us. Folks, look, the law is arguing over terminology and what a word means and what does is mean, as people of our age remember kind of infamously. You just mentioned it, though, the purpose of Congress, the official function of government. I've actually been seeing people argue that the government, the congressional tally, because it's mostly a ceremonial thing, although it has an important role, was not an official act of government. I find it kind of silly, but a lot of the lawyers are like, it's kind of silly, but this is actually something you have to litigate out and explain to people. And there has been some case law on this sort of thing.
I find the notion that the electoral count ceremony is not an official act of government to be that's a risible contention. Yes, it's a ceremony, but so is swearing in a witness in court to testify under penalty of perjury. Now, the witness is never supposed to lie, whether they get sworn in or for some reason that ceremony gets skipped for whatever reason, good or bad. But you're still not supposed to perjure yourself in court, whether you go through that ceremony or not. But there should be no doubt that's an official function of the court. And Not everyone is empowered to swear a witness. You need a clerk of the court. You need a bailiff. You need a judge. You need somebody who is a minister or a officer of that court to perform that function. So too with the electoral count ceremony. Yes, it's an elaborately staged ceremony. Yes, there are almost ritualized objections and almost ritualized dispositions of those objections along the way. And it looks like, when it's done normally, it looks like it's a pretty formal but pretty boring procedure. That doesn't make it not official. That the outcome is preordained does not make it not official. It's still a ceremony that has to happen, and that ceremony is one of the things that is a signal to the American people that what's going on is an important incident of our democracy.
Yeah. Burt, Likko joining us. I think one of the interesting things here, and it goes to official and it goes to legal, the indictment, and I've already covered it because the Trump team and the Trump supporters are saying this is a free speech and election fraud case. And the first two paragraphs, other than the introduction of the indictment, which I have read, we have posted it at ordinary-times.com. First two paragraphs of it, paragraph 2 and 3 are, yeah, Donald Trump had a right to say whatever he wanted to. He even had a right to lie about. Jack Smith agrees with everything that his supporters are saying. But then he goes further when you're just broad brush, because we don't want to dig through all the evidence yet, and Donald Trump's entitled to his defense here. You can lie about it. Where does a lie turn into fraud and conspiracy? When you start trying to get other people to tell that lie, when you use that lie to try to take action in other ways. And as the indictment laid out, they were also litigating this properly through the court channels. There was almost 70 court cases about the election in various forms. They lost every single one of them, but that was the proper thing for them to do, and they had a right to do that. Where does legally, just broadly speaking, so people can understand it when this gets litigated in the press and in the social media, which it inevitably is going to be for us, where's that line where the lie and the free speech lie starts getting into criminal intent by telling others or influencing others? Because that's where you get into fraud and conspiracy, right?
If I'm remembering Trump's public remarks correctly, you have crossed that line by the time he says, you have to go fight. If you don't fight, we won't have America anymore. At that point, he's not saying the election was stolen from me. He is issuing a call to action. He's saying you need to do something more right now. And this is while the ceremony is starting. If you watch the timeline, this is after Congress has come into session to start counting the votes. And he's telling those supporters, you need to go do something right now. And the thing that he's urging them to do is alter the preordained outcome. That is disrupting an official proceeding.
Likko joining us. The other part of this that's getting thrown about a lot is you can say you're going to commit a crime, but if you don't commit a crime, that's still not a crime. That's a fun little online lawyering, locker room lawyer thing. The only problem with that is if you tried to commit a crime and you just sucked at it, does not absolve you from committing a crime. Legally, how can people parse that out when they start seeing that get bandied about on Facebook and Twitter?
If somebody tells you that, ask them where they went to law school, because they probably didn't. First-year law students study the crime of attempt. First-year law students study the crime of conspiracy. These things can tie first-year law students in some intellectual knots, but they're not actually that hard of intellectual knots to work your way out of. Just about everybody does. Conspiracy happens when two or more persons form a common intent to commit a crime, and at least one of them commits an overt act in furtherance. Lawyers and law students who are listening to this, that will sound pretty familiar to them because that got drilled into their heads the same as it got drilled into mine. It got tested of them in their bar exam the same way that it got tested in mine. And that's all there is to it. That's what a conspiracy is. An attempt is an act in furtherance with the specific intent of committing a crime. And the punishment for an attempted murder is the same as for murder. The punishment for an attempted kidnapping is the same for a kidnapping. The punishment for a conspiracy to commit a bank robbery is the same thing as if you had actually robbed the bank. Interesting little piece of trivia here. You may hear somebody respond to, well, then this thing happened, and the objection may be, well, that's not a crime. Yeah, but it can be an overt act in furtherance. You can drive a car to a bank, and that's a perfectly legal thing to do. But if you're driving your co-conspirators to the bank so that they can go inside with guns and rob it, driving that car to the bank becomes your overt act in furtherance of a conspiracy to commit bank robbery.
You'd also know that if you watched the documentary film on the justice system, Legally Blonde, because the first law class, they actually dealt with that exact very thing, criminal intent. Another thing that I wanted to ask you about, though, with this particular set of the indictments, and God, we have to... What a world we live in. We have to set our indictments into batches because there's 3 of them, probably 4 of them by the end of next week. We'll see how that goes. But the Jan 6 indictment set, there was co-conspirators that were just not named, although we know who they are now. They were not indicted at this time. This is a case, unlike the document case down in Florida, the secure that's going to be an evidence-heavy case because, he had this document, he shouldn't have had this document. That's going to be an evidence. You can tell reading this, and this is going to be a testimony-heavy trial. This is going to rely a lot on what we were just talking about. What were you thinking? What did you intend? What's the difference for somebody watching a trial? It's a very different thing. Evidence-based trials where it's physical evidence and a testimony-based trial where you're really, we're both writers. You got to tell a narrative, even though it's in a trial sense. That's basically what the attorneys are trying to do. They're trying to get their narrative to win through the testimony. Just walk folks through that as a layperson as they start watching this unfolds, because that's a very different skill set. Those 2 trials, although it's the same defendant, they're going to be approached very differently, aren't they?
I would imagine so. And part of that is we're dealing with really different kinds of crimes. It's going to be well beyond the amount of time that we have for a nuts and bolts sort of description of how you build a narrative out of questions and answers. But that's a basic mechanism. You the lawyer, ask the witness a series of questions to work through the facts that you need to have brought out. There's a list of legal elements. It's not that hard for you to discern the elements. I've got a list of all the elements in the J6 indictment right now if we want to take the time to have a law school lesson and go through those. But the facts that you ask questions about have to touch on those elements. They have to be somehow relevant to those elements. And once you prove your elements, you have now proven your case. Like I just rattled through the elements of a conspiracy. And these statutory conspiracies in Title 18 have a couple extra elements attached to each of them, like defrauding the United States, which doesn't mean stealing money from the United States. It means altering the outcome of an official proceeding. So you have to prove those things. Just to pick that as an example, Jack Smith or one of the other prosecutors on his team will be asking in the J6 trial of whoever it is that they're calling up to the witness stand, did you intend to have the electoral count ceremony result in Donald Trump being named president for another term? Was that your goal?
Burt Likko joining us. Another bigger picture question, because again, this is going to play out because, we can talk about the evidence in the indictment, but they're going to have evidentiary hearings. Some of this may not make it to the trial. Some of it may. There's a lot to go in. So I'm trying to stay big picture here a little bit. One thing I'm watching, and some of our legal friends have talked about watching, and you can explain to folks, is even though these are separate trials, they're going to be entangled. The January 6th batch of indictments mentions Georgia over and over and over again. We're assuming, if not Donald Trump himself, at least some of these same people are probably going to catch indictments out of the Fannie Willis grand jury down in Georgia. How do folks, the lay people again, the audience, me, people like me, how do they keep this disentangled? Because there's going to be a lot of cross streams in these trials, especially since they're all going to be kind of going on at the same time. You're going to have a hearing for one while the main trial is going for another. How can folks kind of try to keep this separated as they watch this? Because this is going to be going on past the election. This stuff's going to go on for probably a year. And average federal trial is something like 12 to 15 months usually, getting it all the way done from the time it's brought. This stuff's going to go for a couple of years probably. How can folks kind of try to keep this stuff separate, even though in the news and it's all Donald Trump and it's all going to cross their streams? What's a layperson to do trying to keep up with this?
Yeah, that's a big challenge. It's a challenge for lawyers. If a single law firm is handling the defense of all of these cases, they're going to have a board somewhere where they're tracking developments in one case to see how they sort of echo in the other cases. The J6 case and the Georgia election interference case that we assume is going to get started pretty soon here, that's a pretty good example of it, because interference in the Georgia election is part of what's alleged in the J6 indictment. Things that you say in one case are going to be used against you in a different case. And that's part of the lawyer's job, is to keep track of what has been said in each case, make sure that everything is consistent, make sure that everything is leading you on a path calculated to get you to the result that you're hoping for out of the proceeding. I guess my first answer to your question then is it's a challenge. Another thing that is going to be a challenge is remembering that we are dealing with several different systems of courts. The Georgia state court system is not the federal court system. The Georgia state court system is a part of the state of Georgia, which is not the federal government. And it's real easy to get that confused, especially because there are overlapping facts. There are similar kinds of crimes. And all I can tell you is pay attention to which court a statement is made in, which court a judge is acting on behalf of, and remember that there's a lot of cases being prosecuted at the same time in different places and for slightly different kinds of charges.
Burt Likko, I wanted to ask you this before we let you go, though. You wrote Paging Dr. Kubler-Ross, which was your piece about the Pence card and the alternate electors and all that as it was happening before January 6th actually went all the way down and what we saw there. So you've been thinking about this for a while. We're going to link to that whole piece, by the way. You need to read it because it explains exactly why the Mike Pence praise is unwarranted, in my opinion. I understand why people want to go there, but I don't think he gets credit for anything. You've had a while, since December of 2020, to think about this now. Why do you feel differently now that the indictment has come? Obviously, an indictment is step 6 of a 100-step process. But how do you feel differently now? Because people always wondered, would we ever actually have an indictment? Would there actually be criminal charges? Well, now we've got them. How do you feel differently than when you sat down to write that piece before January 6th even happened and you knew what was going to happen? You just kind of saw the legal mess coming. How do you feel now looking back on it?
I think I made a significant mistake in that piece. And that was that appears very towards the end of that essay. I wrote then that I didn't think Donald Trump had the guts to try it. A lot of what I had seen from his behavior before that suggested to me that he was just a bully, that he's just a blowhard, someone who likes to do a lot of posing and posturing and making himself appear a certain way, and perhaps exploiting that appearance when certain people chose to buy into it. But This is a guy who fired people over Twitter. This is a guy who would not look people in the eye in reality when he fired them in the White House. You know, what we saw on The Apprentice years before he entered the political arena, that had all been edited. It didn't look to me like this is a guy who would actually have the guts to really do something subversive towards the rule of law itself, to really do something subversive towards a structure of government. But it turned out he did. It turned out he was willing to go that far. So I was wrong about that. I was not wrong, and I don't think anyone else who made essentially the same sort of analysis that I did, mine is not unique. The legal analysis that Mike Pence lacked the power to alter the outcome of the electoral vote count, I don't feel like that was a gigantic leap. It takes reading the statute. It takes understanding what the procedure is going to be. But he just didn't have that legal ability. Never did. I'm glad he got advice that he didn't have to do that. Thank you for rendering that advice, Dan Quayle. And thank you, Mike Pence, for following the law. The only thing that we can praise Mike Pence for, though, is following the law, which is what we are all supposed to do anyway. Thank you, Mike Pence, for not breaking the law. This is pretty weak praise.
I wonder too, and you just touched on it, how much of this defense, because the judge probably is not even going to allow the free speech and election fraud part of the defense. They probably won't even let that as an argument into the court. They may in some ways, but it's just so ridiculous. They probably won't even make it in the court. A lot of people are thinking this is going to transfer. They're going to start blaming some of these all these co-conspirators were doing it, and Trump was just sitting under it. There's a lot of underlings to this. You talked about him having the guts to do it. He did a lot of sitting around. The transfer of blame to the underlings, is that going to be a big part of this case, do you think?
That's the other thing that is part of Trump's style, is you take somebody who's next to you and you throw them under the bus. He's done it again and again and again. I have a hard time understanding how he can continue to attract people to work with him on anything, because you're going to wind up under that bus at some point. I hope the money along the way was good and get paid up front.
And that's the last thing I wanted to ask you, Burt, Likko, with us. Of the co-conspirators named here, almost all of them are lawyers except for one. What does that tell you? And I'm not making a bad lawyer joke, because there's good lawyers, there's bad lawyers, and most of them fall somewhere in between the two, given on how the day is and how much they got paid. But what does that tell you, that there really is some rot in the lawyer class of folks who are perfectly happy using the law for their own means? That's not a new thing. That's been going on ever since we've had lawyers and law and people. But when you get it with somebody who's like a Donald Trump, or pick whoever that really wants to hold on to power, that really is a lethal combination. And I think we need to have a conversation at some point about that. It's like, look, these are lawyers. These are the people that are supposed to know better, that were really pushing this, the John Eastmans of the world. That needs to be part of this conversation too. We can't just umbrella that under, oh, well, Trump did it and all these other folks. No, there's a lot of bad people that saw Donald Trump as their chance to do a lot of bad stuff. And a lot of them are lawyers.
Mm-hmm. Back at ordinary-times.com, in an earlier incarnation, I think this sort of fell out of fashion during my editorship, but a common quote that people would throw at one another is from a tech guy named Elazar Yudlikowski. I hope I'm pronouncing his names right. But the quote is, "Politics is the mind killer." Once you inject politics into a discussion, in a whole lot of people, and lawyers are certainly not immune from this, reasoning sort of switches off. Logic switches off. Objectivity switches off. When I hear a Republican did X, a little part of my brain turns off the reason and objectivity and stops saying, well, okay, I guess that's something you can do, and turns into, well, that is just the worst thing I've ever heard of. It's evil and wrong and terrible and must be stopped. And, Converse, if you're talking to a Republican about something a Democrat has done. It can be very difficult to distance yourself from what you would normally think of as right and wrong, distance yourself from normally thinking of something that seems like it would be legal versus seems like it would be contrary to law, because it produces partisan advantage. People, and there's nobody listening to this who is immune to it. You and I are not immune to it. And unfortunately, people who are in politics are particularly susceptible to it. You need to train yourself to turn off that part of your brain that immediately switches to say, if it's for my team, it's good, and if it's for the other team, it's bad. You got to turn that off, and you got to turn it off within yourself. John Eastman did not do that. None of these lawyers did that. And they let it grow powerful enough that it overrode whatever legal ethics they had. I don't know if they were ethical lawyers before this, but politics is the mind killer. And if you're going to participate in politics, if you're going to comment on politics and have opinions about it, you got to use your mind, and it's easy to not.
Yep. Unfortunately, human behavior, as we always say, is undefeated. You got to keep that stuff in check. Burt, Likko, I love talking to you about this stuff. Appreciate your time. Let folks know where they can keep up with you till we get you back on, my good friend.
You know, these days I am occasionally writing columns at ordinary-times.com. That's the easiest place to find me. I'm basically off Twitter, X, or whatever it's being called these days. I am posting on Blue Sky right now, but I'm doing that under my actual name. As we've said on other episodes, Burt Likko is a pen name that I've used over the years, and I'm slowly working on retiring that.
Well, don't retire talking to us because we greatly appreciate you, my friend. I enjoy your insight, and I like taking stuff that we wrote a couple of years ago and looking back on it with current events. And we're not always right, but, man, we keep it within the bundle of shots pretty good, not too bad. So well done, my friend. We'll talk again very, very soon. Appreciate your time.
It's always a pleasure, Andrew. Thanks.
Thank you, sir. All the music on Heard Tell is provided under a Creative Content license from monstercat.com.
Somos la máquina.
Folks, if you've listened to the Heard Tell program, you've heard our friend Gabriella Hoffman, but you need to make sure you're checking out her podcast, District of Conservation. It's a podcast exploring the nuances of true conservation efforts from DC and beyond. From topic discussions to exclusive interviews with conservation and energy newsmakers, Gabriella keeps listeners appraised of the latest news stories while elevating important voices. Listen to the District of Conservation on Apple Podcasts or wherever podcasts are played.
Religion is at the intersection of our 21st century life, even if we don't express a faith. At a time when it seems that religion isn't as prevalent as it once was, it still leaves its mark everywhere. As a pastor, I know that religion isn't something I just do on a Sunday, but it's found in every nook and cranny of my life. Sexuality, politics, social media, the economy, war, nationalism, all have some kind of religious angle to them. And as a communicator, I want to find the stories that can help people understand this part of our society that is so important to so many. Hi, I'm Dennis Sanders, and I'm the host of Church and Main. Church and Main is a podcast about the journey of faith and where it intersects with modern life. I look at faith with a journalist's eye, asking the who, where, what, why, and how religion affects some of the major issues of the day. Join me as we journey together. You can listen to Church and Main podcast at the website churchandmain.org or on your favorite podcast app. I look forward to seeing you.
This is the story of the one. As a maintenance engineer, he hears things differently. To the untrained ear, everything on his shop floor might sound fine, but he can hear gears grinding or a belt slipping. So he steps in to fix the problem at hand before it gets out of hand. And he knows Grainger's got the right product he needs to get the job done, which is music to his ears. Call, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.